Paris, grey sky. The clock on the tower read 7:17 when the golden gates of the Élysée Palace opened to receive a guest who was not welcomed by all. Ibrahim Traoré's firm steps echoed on the polished marble as the French delegation observed him in silence. No warm greetings, no protocol smiles, only the icy gaze of those unsure whether they faced an African leader or a political earthquake about to shake Europe's foundations. In the Oval Room, Emmanuel Macron waited. He wore a tailored suit, but hid his nervousness beneath a practiced expression. In the background, two French intelligence officers watched Traoré's every move, as if trying to predict his thoughts. The French president stood, extended his hand, and murmured something polite, but was ignored. Traoré sat first. The silence lasted 12 seconds. Long, sharp, uncomfortable. "President Traoré, thank you for coming here," Macron said, with a faint, restrained smile. "I believe we have a unique opportunity before us. A strategic opportunity." Traoré didn't respond immediately. He observed the tapestries, the paintings of colonial generals, the golden gleam decorating the walls like scars of history. Only then did he speak, in a firm tone. "Strategy is not what France lacks. What it lacked was shame." One of the advisers coughed. Macron swallowed hard, but he smiled. "Let's be direct then," he said, sliding a leather envelope across the table. "In this document, there's a proposal for military and energy cooperation. France is ready to recognize your government, forgive external debts, and finance infrastructure projects in Burkina Faso. In exchange, we ask only for stability and preferential access to the lithium in the Sahel region." Traoré looked at the envelope, then into Macron's eyes. "Is that it? Sell my land for French promises? Pay for your economy's mistakes with my people?" Ibrahim, Macron tried for the first time without the presidential title. "We are not enemies. This pact could save thousands of lives, stabilize the continent." "You're offering me chains in a different color," Traoré interrupted, "and you expect me to smile as if it were an alliance." Macron tried to regain composure, but it was too late. Traoré opened the envelope. He read each clause with the calm of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. He found it, a clause hidden in smaller print: the right of French military presence in strategic points of the national territory. He folded the paper with precision, and then slowly tore it into 4 pieces. "This is my answer." The sound of the paper tearing seemed to echo through the corridors of power. Macron paled. The advisers exchanged glances, and Ibrahim Traoré stood. "President Macron, listen carefully. My people have spent centuries hearing promises, centuries accepting arms wrapped in pretty words. But I didn't come here to sign treaties. I came to say, before the eyes of your republic, that Africa no longer belongs to your maps or your agendas." Macron tried to react, but before he could utter a single word, Traoré walked to the large glass window. He pointed to the gardens outside, where a crowd of exiled Africans held flags of Burkina Faso, Congo, Mali, Niger. There were hundreds, silent, with tearful eyes. "They came because they heard a whisper," Traoré continued. "The whisper that someone would dare to look the empire in the eye and say no." Macron took a step forward, more aggressive. "You're playing with fire, Ibrahim. There are consequences for this kind of disrespect. And there are consequences for centuries of plundering. I learned to walk among ashes, Mr. President. Your threat doesn't burn me." The tension reached irreversible levels, but Traoré maintained the calm of a man who had already faced death. He walked to the door and stopped. He turned only once. "History will no longer be written with French ink on African soil. The time for secret pacts is over. Now is the time of the people." And he left. Outside, the wind cut through, but there was no cold. There was dignity. A respectful silence formed among those waiting for him, and then a shout, a single one, from a small boy dressed in tattered clothes, holding a makeshift sign that read, "Merci, Traoré." The leader knelt before him. He took his red scarf, a symbol of resistance, and tied it around the child's arm. Then he stood and spoke loud enough for the cameras to catch. "Let the children of the colonized know that their parents did not bow." The video went viral. In less than 48 hours, the world watched the moment an African president tore up a French treaty and responded with honor. But what the world didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Behind the scenes of international politics, the echoes of Traoré's act began to cause cracks. Old alliances were questioned. Presidents of other African nations, once silent, began to speak. An emergency meeting of the European Union was scheduled. European newspapers ran headlines like "Africa's Challenge to the Global Order" and "The Day Paris Lost Control of the Sahel." But what many still didn't understand was the real reason Traoré had agreed to go to Paris. Because, in truth, he knew he wasn't going to negotiate. He was going to liberate. On the other side of the continent, in Burkina Faso, the people took to the streets. Thousands in Ouagadougou, holding torches, singing ancient hymns, recalling the times of Thomas Sankara. Women danced with tears in their eyes. Old war veterans saluted in front of television screens. The people understood. The gesture was more than diplomacy. It was a ritual of rupture. Meanwhile, Macron called an emergency meeting with his strategic allies. He tried to understand what had gone out of control. But the problem wasn't in the tactics, it was in the spirit. Because for the first time in many years, an African leader had placed soul before interest, honor before power. On the flight back to Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré didn't sleep. He stayed silent, looking out the window as if searching for something beyond the clouds. Beside him, Colonel Bamba, his trusted advisor, watched the leader's calm demeanor, but recognized the tension vibrating in the air like a taut string about to snap. "You know they won't accept this quietly, Ibrahim," he murmured. "They'll retaliate. They'll try to destabilize, manipulate allies, cut supply lines." Traoré nodded without turning his face. "They've always done that. But now they know they no longer control fear." When they landed, the airport was packed, not with journalists, not with authorities, but with mothers holding children, shepherds with wooden staffs, students raising books like flags. All wanted to see with their own eyes the one who dared to say no on behalf of those who never could. Traoré didn't give a speech. He simply walked among them, touching hands, looking into eyes. For him, that moment wasn't for applause, it was for responsibility. He knew every gesture of his was now a call, and every word a seed. Days later, France's response came swiftly. In an official statement, the French government announced the freezing of all trade agreements with Burkina Faso and suspended humanitarian aid. Western media painted him as radical, reckless, a threat to regional stability. But Traoré didn't react with anger. He reacted with work. He summoned tribal leaders, university students, the military, farmers, local entrepreneurs. And in an assembly held outdoors under a centuries-old tree, he declared, "They call us unstable, but they've never seen a united people. Today, I'm not a president. Today, I'm just another son of this land, who wants to plant freedom in the soil where only fear once grew." The plan was revealed, a new pact, but not with foreign powers, a pact between the people and themselves. The mines would be nationalized, schools would receive books written by African authors, roads would be built by Burkinabe engineers, even if it took 3 times as long. And the lithium would be used with wisdom, not haste. The international community watched in disbelief. The Traoré project wasn't just political, it was symbolic. It challenged the logic of dependency, and that was the heresy empires could not allow. In the early hours of a Tuesday, a group of mercenaries funded by foreign interests tried to invade the presidential compound, but what they found was resistance, not armed, popular. Men and women formed a human chain around the palace, holding lit candles, singing ancestral songs of courage. The mercenaries retreated, not because they were tactically outmatched, but because they realized they weren't just facing a government. They were facing a collective soul awakened. Traoré appeared on the palace balcony at dawn. Tired, yes, but with eyes full of fire. And he said, without a microphone, just with his voice, "The war they plan isn't against weapons, it's against consciousness. But now it's too late. We've already awakened." The phrase spread like wildfire. It was painted on walls, written on clothes, tattooed on arms. In Ghana, Mali, Togo, youth began citing Traoré as a symbol of a new era. In Paris, protests erupted in the suburbs. African immigrants raised signs, "Notre Afrique n'est plus à vendre." Our Africa is no longer for sale. Faced with the narrative collapse, Macron tried a new move. He sent a handwritten letter inviting Traoré to a reconciliation summit in Geneva. He proposed UN mediation, sanctions relief, and a joint fund for sustainable development, but Traoré refused, publicly. "I won't sit at tables where the cutlery has already been chosen," he said before the Council of Elders, "because there, the dish is always the same, our people." What followed was unexpected by all, even his closest allies. Ibrahim Traoré did the unthinkable. He took the contents of Macron's letter and read it on national television, word for word. He revealed the implicit concessions, the wordplay, the hidden terms. It was like watching a public lesson on neo-colonialism. And then, in silence, he walked to a nearby table and burned the letter in a small flame. We don't need invitations to be worthy. We need courage to be free. Meanwhile, abroad, something began to stir. Leaders of small countries, who had never dared speak, began sending messages to Traoré, some with timid words, others with explicit admiration, and then a phone call, not from Africa, from South America. It was Gustavo Rios, president of Bolivia. "Brother," he said, "what you started there echoed here. We're with you." Then came messages from Venezuela, Congo, Laos, even indigenous movements in Canada, all saying, "You are not alone." And that night, after reading hundreds of letters left by young and old, Traoré retreated to his prayer room. No cameras, no advisors, just him, a wooden bench, and a lit candle. There on his knees he whispered, "Lord, don't let me forget that I'm not here to be worshipped but to serve. If my voice grows hoarse, let my life speak. If my feet fail, let the people walk. But never let hope be lost. Ever." The candle went out on its own, but the flame was already lit across a continent. The world watched, but it was a divided world. For the powerful, Ibrahim Traoré was a threat. For the oppressed, a hope. And between these two extremes, a new Africa was being born, still fragile, still bleeding, but standing. An extraordinary meeting was called in Brussels. EU leaders, NATO chiefs, even IMF consultants were present. At the center of the table, dossiers stamped with Traoré in red letters, analyses, simulations, projections, but none of them knew how to contain what was no longer just a man. It was a movement. "He's too charismatic," said a German minister. "And he's not playing by the rules of the game. Maybe because that game was never made by him," a Spanish diplomat retorted, almost guiltily. At the same time, in Burkina Faso, Traoré was at a harvest ceremony with farmers. Hands dirty with soil, face burned by the sun, but eyes calm as if seeing beyond. One of the farmers, a man named Malik, over 70 years old, approached. "I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime, Ibrahim." A president with his feet in the mud. Traoré smiled, picked up a hoe and replied, "You don't govern a land without first loving it, and you don't love what you don't touch." That night, the image of Traoré carrying sacks of cassava went viral again. But what caught attention wasn't the act. It was the caption written by a young African activist. "He harvests with us today because he planted dignity yesterday." Meanwhile, in Paris, Macron was cornered. Domestically, his government faced protests. Internationally, his image as a global diplomat was tarnished. He couldn't admit it, but Traoré's gesture had started a domino effect. Then came a final attempt. Not negotiation, but defamation. A fake dossier was leaked to the European press, suggesting Traoré was enriching himself with mineral resources and diverting funds to tax havens. Headlines appeared in prestigious newspapers, "The other side of Traoré, the African Messiah with hidden accounts." But the response came faster than expected. On national television, Ibrahim Traoré called a press conference, broadcast worldwide. In front of dozens of international journalists, he opened his own bank account live. He showed every transaction, every expense, every cent donated, invested, shared. And then he said, "You thought I was like you, but you didn't understand. I don't fight for thrones, I fight for seeds." Absolute silence, until a Nigerian journalist, moved, began to clap. Then another, then all. Not as applause, but as recognition, as witness. In that moment, even the most skeptical critics began to waver. Something was off the equation. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just incorruptible, he was irreducible. And that's why weeks later, when the United Nations gathered to discuss the new African geopolitical order, the unexpected happened. For the first time, a Burkina Faso leader was invited to speak at the opening of the General Assembly. The auditorium was packed, heads of state, ambassadors, analysts, and at the center of the podium, Traoré. No papers in hand, just a small wooden artifact. a beaded necklace made by children from a poor village, sent as a gift. He began with a pause, looked at everyone, and then spoke. "I don't come here to ask. I come to remind that the world forgot that the small also have a voice, that the Sahel bleeds, but sings, that Africa is not a continent of scarcity, but of stolen abundance." Curious glances turned into tearful eyes. "They called me radical," he continued, "but radical is one who uproots something at its core, and that's what I'm doing, uprooting the root of submission." The speech was broadcast in 72 languages. It was interrupted 7 times by applause, and it ended with a phrase that would become a symbol of a generation. "Freedom is not asked for, it is planted, and watered with courage until it blooms." As he left, reporters tried to surround him. Questions came from all sides. What's the next step? Do you fear retaliation? What if they try to remove you from power? But he didn't answer with words. He looked at the nearest camera and extended his hand, holding the beaded necklace. "As long as there are children making necklaces with hope, no regime can bring me down." The video exploded online. Over 100 million views in a week. But for Traoré, numbers didn't mean victory. Victory was seeing a young woman named Aminata, once uneducated, now building a community library with donated books. Victory was seeing soldiers teaching children to plant, not to fight. Victory was looking at the sky and knowing that, even amid storms, light still found a way through. Upon his return to Burkina Faso, he was greeted with silence. But it wasn't absence, it was reverence. The people formed a human corridor to the presidential palace, each person holding a seed, thousands of seeds, a symbolic offering, and then, as if in a liturgical act, Traoré knelt, took a handful, and said, "May the earth receive us, may memory guide us, may the future no longer need heroes, only just men." He planted there, in the ground of the square, with his own hands. And in that instant, without flags, without speeches, without euphoric crowds, we understood. The greatest act of revolution is not to destroy the old, it is to cultivate the new.